a teacher who is transitioning into the project-based language immersion methods, the Alive framework of teaching, asked with quite a lot of concern recently, how do I know if I'm preparing the students for the exams, for the assessments? I need to know what's on the assessments so that I can prepare them. And I wanted first, upon hearing this, to just hold her hand and first just say, I'm so sorry you've been through that. That is exactly how we've made teachers feel. We have normalized teaching to the test, even though we use that phrase negatively. We have completely normalized it, enforced it. You could say incentivized it, but I would say enforced it. And teachers have learned to live in fear. What if my students aren't ready for the test? What if my students aren't ready for the test? This is one of the big reasons that I love working in the language education space is because I think it's a space where we can still save education from some of its worst ideas. Partly because it's not as regulated or incentivized in our field as it is in fields like math and reading. So, a lot of language educators, or more accurately, corporations trying to profit in the language education space, have taken this idea of standardized testing and developed versions of it to help us structure our curriculum in the language education space, to which I say, no thanks. It's a terrible idea that's very harmful and makes everyone's experience of learning worse. Let's just stick with being ignored by that system. I would love to be neglected by the heavily standardized testing based system and the teach to the test mentality. So if you are working in a school that has adopted one of those programs, I'm so sorry, but please know that that's a choice. It's generally not mandated from any outside agency, and it's probably not super helpful to actually optimizing your program. And so if you're adopting the Alive framework, please know you will not be forced into any teach to the test type of mentality. In fact, we do have 3 levels of assessment that we use, which any good program would use some version of, but it is not what this teacher was thinking when she asked this question. So the first thing to know is that we'll start from the overall view, okay? In lieu of a standardized test, a state annual test, whatever national tests or state tests you might be used to prepping for in other subject areas, what we use is a measure of their communicative competence. So if you're working with the ACTFL ACTFL system, you'll be using something called or something similar to the OPI, the Oral Proficiency Interview. If you're using the CEFR program, you also have a sort of a proficiency exam that works slightly differently, but we are mostly focused on the spoken language part of the proficiency, particularly where language vitality is important. Spoken proficiency is the only thing that will propel language vitality forward, so it is the main and sometimes only thing we assess for. So first of all, it's going to be spoken. Second of all, it's going to be an interview. It's going to be a live, authentic back and forth conversation with a real person. There is no substitute for it being a real person. And that person must be either an L1 speaker, native speaker, member of the target or focal culture, however you want to phrase that, or someone who is very, very highly proficient. In some communities, we don't have enough people who are still available, who have L1 or first culture knowledge, but they definitely have to be very highly proficient in that. This is not something that would just be administered by just anyone. It would be administered entirely in the language with zero reference to translation. But the most important thing to know about it is that it's a real conversation. There is a structure, there is a plan and a set of techniques, and I'm happy to set up a training with your community to help you know those techniques for how to do the interview and make it really effective. But when you're actually being interviewed, it will not feel like it's a bunch of strategies. It will feel and it will unfold like a real actual conversation between two human beings. What that means is the more that your students are comfortable, confident, and competent at real life, spontaneous, in context communication, the higher level of proficiency they will demonstrate during that experience. Something to know about that experience is that it is to gauge proficiency levels. It does not gauge effort, classwork, doesn't even gauge class attendance, and it does not gauge the traditional idea of accuracy, right or wrong answers. You can't study for it. You can't. That's kind of the point. You can't study for real life conversations because you don't know how they're going to go. Every conversation is organic and it goes a different way. That's why I'm saying it absolutely has to be administered by a real human with real cultural grounding and really high language proficiency because they have to be able to just organically flow with the conversation in a way that is linguistically and culturally representative. So it is not something that you can study for, and it is not something that you can teach to. I've seen organizations try to teach to it, and it's kind of a fool's errand because, by definition, it's organic. It's about how well your student can say whatever comes to their mind at that time. The only way to really teach to a test like that is, of course, first of all, having a robust program where they learn how to talk about a lot of different things and more importantly, where they learn to talk spontaneously and authentically, and they are comfortable doing so. If they are always used to scripted or artificial spoken language, when they get into a genuine, authentic conversation with someone, like it will be on the assessment, they will struggle. So, the actual, real, genuine communication that they do in class is what prepares them for that real, genuine communication in that conversation. But the other thing to understand is that it's about accuracy matters, mispronouncing things or getting grammar wrong or saying the wrong word in a certain place, using a calc from the L1. Those are noticed, those are considered. But the absolute most important part of this kind of assessment is how much can you communicate? How much can I talk to you? I have to be able to understand you. I have to be able to follow what you're saying, but you also have to understand my questions, my follow-ups, anything I might share in return. You have to be able to respond appropriately. It has everything to do with authentically communicating and expanding the communication into longer, more interesting, more complex, more personalized topics. There is no right or wrong. And that is why, because that is true in real life, and that is why we are abandoning right, wrong teaching practices in the classroom, because that is not how language works in the real world. It is not a right, wrong test out there. It is organic communication, the ability to keep the conversation going, get your ideas across, and handle ideas that are coming at you. So some of the skills that are really key in that, because it is organic and flowing, and you may not even know the person who's interviewing you, but even if you do, you may not know what they're going to ask you or how they're going to react to your responses. The really key skills there are the skills that they use to figure out what something means if they've never heard it before, or to ask for clarification if they're not sure what something means, or to explain that they haven't understood that this question is going over their head. Yeah, they just can't do it. They need another question. Those skills to navigate communication hiccups and communication breakdowns, they are going to need them. That is for sure, because the underlying structure that I said we do trainings on has the interviewer very intentionally make the conversation more complex, more in depth, more advanced until the point that the student can't really engage anymore. It's too much for them. It's going over their head. We have to get them to that point so that we know what they're capable of. So it is designed to push them to the point where they start to stumble and aren't really able to fully engage because something is too complex for them. Then we know where they cap out. So the skills to handle something like that and the confidence to just keep going and to say, I don't understand, or I don't know anything about that, or I'm not sure what that means, or I don't really know how to say what I want to say about that. Those kind of skills, those are really important real world communication skills, and they will be important in an assessment of oral proficiency. The other type are the type when they are having trouble spontaneously figuring out how to say what they're thinking. So things like, I'm not sure what the word is, or how would you say it, or it's a type of a thing that does this, but it's bigger, but it's like that. Those strategies, which are collectively known as circumlocution, they will need those because they will be surprised by something they never discussed before. They will run into words they hadn't thought of before. They may have a really complex idea, like maybe they have a strong opinion about this, but they don't really know how to say anything more than I don't like it. So that they would say, I don't like it. I'm not really sure how to explain more, but yeah, I have a strong feeling I don't like that. So they've successfully navigated the communication scenario, even though they haven't known every word in the language. Nobody ever knows every word in the language. No one is ever going to be capable of navigating every single communicative situation to a fantastic or ideal level of proficiency. I'm an L1 English speaker, and I say all the time when I'm talking about something new and interesting, I'm not sure what the word would be, but it's something like this. Or, yeah, I'm not quite sure how to express my idea, but I feel like I agree with you, but I kind of want to go further. I talk like that in my L1 all the time. We ask each other, what is that called? What is it called when people do that? What's that one word they say when people do that? What's the term for that? We say stuff like that in our L1 all the time. So if you're harboring some idea that your students will be successful on assessments because they know every word in the language or they never make an error in what they say, you're misunderstanding how languages are learned. Those aren't real things. Um, it's all about their situational competence, their ability to navigate through situations. So, yes, circumlocution and asking for clarification and guessing at the meaning of words and making comparisons between things, describing things, those are communicative skills that absolutely should be part of your curriculum because they will use them on the assessment, but there is no such thing as teaching to the test. Another important point is that assessment, I don't like to say exam or a test because that's not what it is, but that assessment of oral proficiency is not a direct assessment of your class or your teaching. It is very valuable data for you. You must care about it. You must pay attention to it. But it is not a direct assessment of your classroom or your teaching because it is not based on what you've been teaching in class. In fact, you don't ever need to, in fact, maybe you shouldn't, have any conversation with the person who is doing the assessing about, well, this is what we've been covering in class, or this is what we've been talking about, or this is what we have and haven't learned. That is not part of it. This is supposed to be spontaneous. It's supposed to be a real world encounter with someone that they don't know or weren't expecting to speak to today on topics that they aren't anticipating. It is not based on what you've been doing in your classroom. It's based on real life. So again, there is no such thing as teaching to it. At the same time, it does show whether your students' ability to communicate using the language in real life is improving or not. It's not going to give you data like, oh, your students mastered all of Unit 2, but they have only mastered 60% of Unit 3. It's not going to give you any data like that because it has no relationship to what you've been teaching in your classroom intentionally. It is going to give you data like 30% of your students have gained one proficiency level, but 70% have not gained any proficiency level. That means that what you're doing in your classroom is not effective, assuming this has been a good amount of time, um, has not been effective during that period of time in increasing their proficiency in the language. To be honest, that's a more holistic, or you could say a more brutal assessment of your teaching. Because if you're teaching to a textbook and you're having them take the chapter 3 test or whatever, you can get all excited. Oh, 90% of my students passed the chapter 3 exam from the textbook. I mean, great. But all that that means is that they passed the chapter 3 assessment. That doesn't give you any information about how that's going to translate to real life communication abilities. So in this approach, we have skipped over the middleman and we are just directly assessing their real life communication abilities. If your course is not increasing, is not resulting in increased proficiency in real world communication for most or all or a large number of your students, your course isn't sufficiently effective. I mean, it's not leading them to be fluent speakers, and that was the goal. It's not meeting the goal, so it's not effective. Now, what needs to be fixed about it? That needs to be a separate conversation. The interview alone, or even 20 interviews alone, cannot give you that information. That's going to go back to the methods, okay? And I'm happy to help with that. But if whatever you are doing in your classroom is effective in producing new fluent speakers of this language, then there is a rate at which you should see those proficiency results go up. Not like weekly, not like monthly, but at certain intervals, which we can have a detailed conversation about, you should see the proficiency assessments go up. If they're not going up, or they're not going up for all students, there's something that needs adjustment in the classroom. Let's talk about it. Let's figure out what it is. But you can't teach to them, okay? You can actually just go ahead and forget about them in between data gathering times. Now, there's two other forms of assessment that you do need to know a lot more about, you need to be more involved in. The first and most obvious, I think, is summative assessment. That means that at the end of each unit, there's an assessment of what the student did in the unit. If you are in a school system or a teaching scenario where you are asked to give a grade, this is where you will get the grade. If you can get away with not doing grades, please don't. They're really not productive in language programs, maybe anywhere, but definitely not in language programs. Grades are really not appropriate in language programs. So if you do need to get a grade, you're going to get it from the summative assessment. That is the assessment that you built into each unit of curriculum, where the student somehow presents or demonstrates or shares their product, whether individually or in a group, and their product is assessed on a set of criteria in terms of how well it demonstrates certain skills, language skills and content skills. Okay, content skills means everything that's not language. Maybe you worked on some math, maybe you worked on how to run a business, maybe you worked on historical knowledge, maybe you worked on arts and crafts, whatever it is you worked on, whatever it is they were learning to do through the medium of the language, there's assessment of how well they are doing that thing now, how well they have acquired those skills, and how well they are able to express it in the language. Both are assessed on a summative assessment, and a combination of them is the grade. So here, the extent to which the student is making an effort, is participating, is showing up to class, is engaging with the activities, et cetera, is going to make a huge difference because they're going to be either more or less able to demonstrate the skills at the end of the unit. This is where the student really has the most control, is the most responsible, and where we can go ahead and give them a grade if that's something that we need to do. At the same time, I put an asterisk on that because this is also data for you as a teacher. So even though we do hold students accountable, we give them grades, we send home notes based on how these public products, these summative assessments went, it is actually the most important data is for you as the teacher. Was this unit effective in transmitting the skills that you aimed to transmit? How effective was it in transmitting the skills? How effectively were they able to demonstrate those skills at the end of the unit? If it wasn't great, if you're disappointed, that is really good data for you to go back and look at the unit, how it's designed, and how you implemented it. What could be done to implement this unit, to design or implement this unit in a way where they really would demonstrate most of those skills by the end of it? Happy to help with that. So that is a thought process that you should engage in, even though you've given the student a grade. It should still be something you really appreciate for feedback for you, and you should be looking to have the vast majority of students getting a pretty good grade. That would mean that you taught effectively and they did in fact gain those skills. This is why I'm against grading, because if your students didn't gain those skills, especially en masse, it's really more of an indication of this way of teaching them not working than it is of them. So yes, I have very high expectations of students, and yes, they have to put in the effort, but if the majority of students put in effort and still don't gain skills, then it's not the students. So we do have to look at that, okay? And then the final type of assessment that we have is formative assessment. Now, this is part of all learning. The key with formative assessment, I think, is that for language teachers in particular, it can be really, really hard to sit on our hands, pull our hands back, stop interfering, and just witness, are the students able to complete the task, either the content skill or the communicative task, without my help? Have they had enough practice, enough demonstration? Have they already done enough dry runs that when I plan a formative assessment, which I often don't even say anything to the students about, often it's just me who knows that this activity is going to count as my formative assessment. I know that we're ready. I know that we've done enough buildup. They've practiced. They've shown me that they're ready. So during that formative assessment, I am going to sit on my hands. I am not going to help unless it's an obvious train wreck and I can just take that data and then help the student not to be completely embarrassed. That might happen, but I still took the data that it was a train wreck. But I don't want my students to go through any horrific embarrassments. It's going to cost us in the long run. Or, if the whole thing has fallen apart and I've realized my whole setup to this really didn't work, then I basically just don't consider it a formative assessment and I help the students get through it. And then I have to replan how I'm going to do it. But otherwise, it is a time where I am watching and listening and witnessing. Can they, independently without my help, complete the skills that we have been practicing? A formative assessment is only for the teacher. There are some exceptions. There are some courses that share it with the student and ask the student to respond to it. I'm not saying that's always wrong, but those are for specialized situations. Basically, there has to be a good justification for why you think that will be effective. It's very resource heavy. It's very time consuming to have students review their formative assessments, and there's only a few teachers who are really leveraging it to help their progress. A lot of times, the reason students are being involved in the discussion of how they did in their formative assessment is because the teacher is wanting to blame them, is wanting to say, well, you didn't show up enough, or you didn't try hard enough, or you guys aren't listening, or look at Becky, she's doing a great job, you should all be more like her, or some kind of shaming, blaming thing is happening with the formatives. This is heavily embedded in the tradition of quizzing, which I have other videos where I talked about. Stop quizzing, especially in the novice level, but in general, reduce this behavior. Either it's time for them to learn and you're coaching, which does mean a gradual release of responsibility, or it's time for them to be assessed and you're not coaching and you're just witnessing how it goes and using that data. But that data is letting you know, from the formatives, it is letting you know whether the lessons that built up to this formative sufficiently prepared the students to independently exercise those new skills, or whether they're not ready to move forward and they need reteaching and they need a different approach and they need more practice before they can independently execute those skills, whatever they were on your calendar. So if your formative flops, if it's not smooth sailing for the vast majority of students, that really isn't information about the students. It's information about your lesson calendar and your lessons and how they've been going. And again, it's something to reach out. I'm happy to help. But it's a chance for you to change something and intervene in the situation before it's too late, before it's a month ahead of time or it's several weeks away, and they've sort of forgotten about that now and they're going into the high stakes assessment and they're still not ready. And now you're about to give them a grade because they weren't ready on something that you knew they weren't ready on, which is kind of a bait and switch. So it's really important that teachers take full accountability for formative assessment data, making sure that it really was an assessment, that they weren't rigging the game by overly coaching during that assessment activity, but also keeping those results as data about their methods in teaching, not data about whether these students are behaving or not. This is a really important distinction. So you have three levels of assessment that we do in the Alive framework. The first is language proficiency assessment. I recommend doing that twice per year because when you are fully implementing the Alive framework, within 2 years, you have students reaching the advanced low, sometimes higher, reaching a highly proficient level. So progress does go fast, and I think it's beneficial to students. It is, however, very resource intensive to do spoken interviews and spoken competency assessment. And so I know that there are institutions that are only going to do it once a year. But because I really strongly believe in the 2-year goal to high proficiency, I really strongly encourage institutions to conduct the assessment twice per year. The next one is summative assessments, which gauge language skills, content skills, and general effort, participation, implementation of the project by the student, and those ones can be used for grading if you must. And the final one is formative assessment, something that is on our calendars. It spirals through our calendars. We know when a formative assessment activity is going to take place. We have to take responsibility that we treat it like an assessment, not with a bunch of fanfare or stress or anything, but just that we withdraw our coaching and let the students try things independently and we get an honest assessment of where they're at. And also in the sense that that data is used by us to make adjustments from there forward. That's what formative means. It changes what we do next. I hope this helps you to see these things flow very naturally. Students generally, not only do they not feel huge pressure around them, they often look forward to them. This really, really transforms the experience of assessment. We do get data. We do get objective peeks at how we're doing. It's all in there. But it is generally, when these are executed correctly, they are not sites of anxiety. They are not things that people cram all night for. They are not things that people have a meltdown because they didn't get the score they were hoping to get. They are opportunities either to learn or to show what you have learned that people enjoy doing. They feel ownership of, they feel they're using their own creativity and expressing themselves to do it. So they enjoy doing it as well as they find the feedback helpful. When we use those rubrics, when we educate them about the levels of language proficiency and we educate them about the growth we see and the next steps of growth that they can take with those proficiency levels, they find that helpful. They find that motivating. So they look forward to the opportunity to be assessed. I know it might sound crazy, but this is true. And that just goes to show you what assessment can be when it's based in healing, relationship building, empowering, and building a speaker community, rather than based in hierarchy and shame and catching people for not knowing things.